Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting. I call the September 7th, 2022 City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting to order. I'm today here with my fellow council members, Council President Walsh and Council Member Ray, who is a member of this committee, has an excused absence this evening. There will be multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting, and we do have 2 agenda items. There will be a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on tonight's agenda item. So the first item of business will be public comment. And I will check in with the city clerk if there are any individuals who have indicated a desire to speak this evening.
Chair Hunt, no one has signed up prior to the meeting, and we have no virtual attendees.
Okay. Thank you for that. As a reminder, written comments can be submitted at any time to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. And then with that, we will move to approval of the minutes, which are the minutes from the August 4th meeting. And I will move to approve the minutes as amended because there was a correction that was made earlier today just for the purposes of accuracy. So with that, I'll move to approve the minutes. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Minutes as amended are approved. And with that, we will go to our 2 agenda items, the first of which is ID 0976, Storm and Surface Water Master Plan. This will be presented by Gary Schimmick and Alan Quinn. Gary, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very excited to be presenting here tonight. This has been a quite a long process, and we're nearing the end. So again, I'm Gary Schimmick. I am a Utilities Strategic Advisor here, former Utilities Division Director, and Alan Quinn will be joining us shortly, and he's a Senior Stormwater Engineer. If we could go to the next slide.
I'm sorry, we are not seeing the slides on the meeting.
PowerPoint's slow and coming up.
PowerPoint is slow. My apologies, I wasn't expecting to do this, so just bear with us for a second.
Not a problem. We could also call a quick recess if necessary, so just let me know.
Oops, I think we have the land use code up. I don't think I would do a good job with that. I could try, but. we go. All right, as a reminder, we're here to talk about the storm and surface water master plan, moving towards final adoption. Again, I am Gary Schimmick, and Alan Quinn will be joining us shortly. So if we could go to the next slide. So our purpose today is to take the next step towards the completion of the Storm and Surface Water Master Plan that started in 2019, just before the pandemic, if you all remember that little incident that occurred. So we're here to provide a status report on our progress to date and seek your feedback before going to full council on this item. Next slide, please. Direction that we're seeking. In terms of your feedback, we are seeking your comments on the methodology to develop our proposed priority CIP list in addition to the actual projects. So it's important that we're seeking both from you tonight. Next slide, please. This slide is a brief reminder of our community council and board commission touch points. And again, we started in 2019, right before I joined, so Mr. Quinn kicked this off with a very extensive kickoff meeting that included city officials, agencies, and the public. And we have gone all the way to the environmental board before coming here today. I did want to note we will be seeking Parks Board input this coming month before coming to full council. So that will be another item that we have on our path towards adoption. Next slide, please. So our agenda for tonight includes the draft final plan. Just a reminder what's in the contents, our schedule, and the next two are kind of the really big pieces here, the prioritization process recap and the screening for the final CIP. We'll also talk about the metrics used for prioritization and the final CIP list. Next slide, please. So the contents. The first three items we presented to council and to boards and commissions and to the community. And those were the existing conditions assessment of really all of the data that Alan had worked with judiciously with staff and our consultants to round up from the last couple decades that we have in Issaquah. We've had a lot of information. We also then looked at and brought to you our stormwater master, the stormwater options list and metrics, and we also talked about our stakeholder engagement along the way. And those will all be documented in the plan as chapters. What will also be in there is what we're talking about tonight, the final priority stormwater management options list. Next two items are going to be developed over the next period before final council adoption, which will be the schedule and those budget needs for those lists. We have a preliminary idea for that, but Councilmember Hunt had a question on that today, and that schedule, really all these projects that we'll be talking about today will be working in the long-term schedule over the next, we're hoping to get all these projects on the docket over the next 20 years, hopefully a lot earlier. We'll also have a section on adaptive management and basin prioritization and the stormwater management action plan, which are requirements from ecology to have in this plan. Next slide, please. And our schedule. So we're here today, and we're also going to be moving again towards the Parks Board in September, and then the adoption to final council in November. What you also see is happening as the start of today is a SEPA review that will be going on, and also the ecology review of the manual. And then also our internal city staff review, which will include those additional steps for the schedule and the budget. So if we, the caveat here with the yellow marker there in November, that if we receive significant comments from SEPA and ecology, we may need to come back for a committee meeting before. We're not anticipating any comments out of the ordinary from SEPA or ecology, but if we do, that may change the schedule. But we've been very transparent in our process, I think, as you know, to date. So we really, we believe we would have had any really difficult, challenging comments that already would come in. But I just want to, to add that out here. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, I think this is a jam-packed slide, but I think this is really important, and this is really my most important slide to get across. Alan's going to be talking about the projects. But I really wanted to step you through how we went from the 303 known issues to where we are today, at the 10 projects. So let's just start with the 303 known issues. That came from, again, Alan's work talking to staff, community members, elected officials, administration, through the workshops, and just our database. So really it was a compilation of everything that we knew about in terms of existing issues. Now, and we put these into 3 main categories that we've talked to you about: flooding, water quality, and then restoration habitat. But these issues range from some very large issues in Old Town that we know about, and some very small issues. But we took everything in. It was all comers type of approach. Like let's hear it all. And I think we actually pinned, had some workshops where people pinned things on the map and gave us their comments. So hopefully very extensive at that time. So we moved from 303 known issues to our 41 high priority issues. Now, why 41? It's just, that's where in the ranking it kind of fell out to cut things on 41. Now, we got there again by a robust prioritization, in-house staff from across the department, and also a few community members looking at taking the time to look at all of these problems, 303, ranking them, averaging the scores, and having some good discussions along the way. But these, again, are issues, right, going from 303 to 41 priority issues. So the next step was then looking at how could we best solve and address these issues. And what's interesting is thankfully the number went down from 41 to 23, because what's that saying is these projects, some of them, not all of them, but some of them take into account multiple issues. So it's multiple objective projects. If it was one-to-one, right, one project for one issue, we'd be coming with you to 41 projects. But as you'll see as Alan talks through these, some of these projects are able to hit a couple of those 2 or 3 priority issues. So this was kind of an exercise in compilation trying to optimize our projects. So that's how we got to 23. The next step, again, these are now projects. We call them SMOs. That's an ecology term, but for the sake of this evening, we'll just capital projects. And we applied ecology-approved metrics that we have shared early on with council and the community to all of those projects. And we can go back to the metrics in the next slide, but that got us down to 10. The 10 projects that we're here today. So again, just to recap, went from issues, prioritize issues, how do we wrap those into projects, and then what are the highest priority projects. I do want to say that on this page, and this is, Alan and I have been talking about this from day one, this plan that hopefully we'll be adopting this year is a living and breathing document, right? So these issues and projects that we've identified that may not be in the top 10, they're still there. And that's going to be part of the adaptive management process. So we're not forgetting about them. We're not just throwing them out. We're always going to be having those as potential projects in the future if we learn more about them. So I just wanted to be really clear on that, that those will be available and not just discarded.
Question from Council President Walsh.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the description of how that funnel happened. And I understand how this is then going to be represented within the plan that you're talking about.
Yes.
With the CIP, it's usually represented in a 6-year CIP, but you talked about all of those 10 projects being completed in a 20-year time period. So how does that get figured out? And then I know we're kind of rethinking our CIP and what should be included in that. How do we effectively keep track of the other 13 items that wouldn't necessarily make it into the CIP, but are desired projects for the city?
Great question. Yeah, and I can hit all of those. Let's start with how these 10 will make it into the CIP. So right now, we have been, Alan and I, Matt and others have been working with Robert and Susie in finance, and we do have a CIP plan that's coming to you. And most of those are projects that have already been identified, have been worked through, and they're quality projects that we feel very comfortable with and would like to move forward with. There's a line item in the budget that calls out for implementation of this plan. And that's where these projects will then be placed after your approval. So at the next cycle, those will be, you'll take away the placeholder basically and put these actual projects in. So that's how those will come in. So number 2, of how long it will take, that's what we're going to find out over the next month or two of what, given our funding levels, how quickly, and our staffing levels, how quickly can we move these projects forward? Some of them are, relatively, small to moderate projects that with the available staffing and budget will probably move forward in the next couple of years. There are a couple, for example, the Old Town project. It is a big project, and it's going to be in coordination with King County, and we don't have a dollar amount on that yet. But it may be multiple stages. So that is just an example of a project that may take 10 years itself to actually plan, implement, and construct. But we'll give you a better handle of that at the next council meeting. Then the final piece you asked about, the ones that didn't make the list. I think every budget cycle from here on, we're going to be coming back to this plan. And that's going to be the adaptive management aspect of this, and I think we'll describe that in the plan. But it will be a case of, okay, well, how does the CIP look? What have we learned about these projects? And should we make some changes here based on what we know? But that would be a question we're going to look at every time is this still the best list, or should something else replace it? So a minimum, we're coming back to this at every budget touch, coming back to this plan.
Maybe I could just amplify that answer just a little bit. We are in the early stages of sorting through a process that I think we're hearing from the council and our boards and commissions more closely links with some of these longer-term plans like this plan. So I would imagine that that process will basically use those plans as a library. We'll take them off the shelf every 2 years, look at them, and as we come back to the council, have some sort of crosswalk that says, here's what's in those plans. I mean, we've mobility master plan, climate action plan, all the plans as well as I do. But we'll be very intentional with that. I think what Gary is saying is that some of the nature of these projects will continue to evolve. So yes. I think as we're taking down the plans and referring to them, I mean, that evolution will happen. It may not happen every single year. Conditions change, of course, but I think we will look at it in that 2-year cycle as we have previously, starting this coming spring.
Thank you. All right, let's the next slide, please. So the metrics. So again, these are the ecology approved and also community and council approved metrics. And these are what helped us get from the 23 projects to the 10. Ran all of these metrics through, and that's what really what guided numerically the process. So again, just let's go over them real quickly. The first one actually came out of one of our meetings with the community. Effectiveness, one of benefits to Lake Washington, or Lake Sammamish. That was something that we had a really good discussion with the community about, and not only just effectiveness of solving the problem, but how is it actually benefiting Lake Sammamish? So that was an interesting one that we came in. And, standard things that we've talked about before: land ownership, constructability, permitting, cost, funding opportunities. That's just a big example of our work in Old Town with King County. That's where you're going to see there's going to be leveraging a lot of dollars with the King County Flood Control District. Timing, coordination, partnership, regulatory requirements, environmental, social justice, and public input. So I feel very strong and robust categories for us to score those projects. Next slide, please. So then where we're at again is these 10 selected projects, and then what we'll be doing after we just kind of get your nod today that these do look like a good package. We'll be finalizing those concept designs for the 10 and the costs, and then also the schedule, so you can have a better feeling for how this will play out over the next 6 to 10 years. And those would be meshed, of course, with what we already have on in the CIP, so we'd work that in together so you can see that. Next slide, please.
Sorry, before you
Oh, sure.
go on, can I ask, unless maybe I'll save this question if you're going to get to it, but in our packet, it does talk about that there were the 23 SMOs using the quantitative metrics, which I think you just spoke to, and then there was also 1 cover each basin in the city and 2 emphasized water quality retrofit projects. That second one, emphasized water quality retrofits project, I did ask that by email. I'm not sure I get it though. So is that to emphasize improvements to our existing infrastructure rather than new projects? So, keep our existing infrastructure.
In a way, so when we had if you remember, we got down to 41 issues, right? And so those issues were water quality, flooding, and restoration or habitat. When we looked at the issues related to water quality, what we tried to promote was retrofit of roadways. So that's the terminology we're using. So if we're going to propose a solution, let's focus on the roadways, because that's where we know the most problems are at, the 6 PPD, copper, other issues, rather than a solution that maybe is in a park or something else that still would have capture area. But that's where we wanted to emphasize is that roadway treatment, where there is none exactly. We're building on, but it actually has none. And that was something I think that ecology wanted us to look at as well, because of course, the 6 PPD issue that popped up, but also copper and other things. That would really, if we're going to spend the money for treatment, right, that would give us the biggest benefit to do. So it wasn't. So I apologize for that. It was a little confusing. We didn't have that as a metric to score the projects, but it was when we looked for solutions to solve the issues. That's what was at the top of our mind.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. I think for me, just the emphasized water quality retrofits doesn't necessarily, to me, without knowing more about the roadways. So that was helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely. It's just a quick map showing you all of our basins here that are part of the city and then part of this plan. Next slide, please. And then the ranking process adjustment. So this is after we came up with our original list of 10, just through those, what we'll call the ecology-approved metrics that what we talked about. What we noticed was that there wasn't as much geographic diversity of projects and variety. Now, let me take a step back and explain why from my perspective. Those rankings really are individual projects, right? Those metrics that we were using, effectiveness, social justice, all of those really were ranked by the project. So we really didn't know what would come up with the portfolio after we applied those to the projects. So this ranking is what I would call a portfolio approach to get around and diverse package of 10 projects. So we resulted in substituting 4 of the projects to kind of achieve these goals. So that when you look at these 10, we are hoping you see 2 things. Oh, there is a diversity of projects across the city. Oh, and they hit flooding, water quality, and habitat. Now, what about those 4 projects that came off? They're good projects, right? There's no doubt about that. They're good projects, but they would be, as we talked in that, the next round of CIPs, as Wally mentioned, when we come back to another round in a couple years, those will probably be the next 4 that we'll be on. So there's no, again, no reason we couldn't have stayed with the original 10, but we feel this was really the original intent when we started this whole project, that we would come out with, again, geographic diversity and a package across water quality, flooding, and habitat.
Thank you. Council President Walsh?
Thanks. So when I look at the details of which projects were swapped out, I see that 3 of the 4 that were substituted away were Newport Way water quality retrofits. And so one of those was kept on there, retrofit 1, but 2, 5, and another one related to flow control and water treatment or water quality treatment were substituted. So can you talk through what the difference is between those? Because it seems like some of those maybe, do they build upon each other? Are they just different segments of the Newport Way area? What is that difference?
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
You want to, see, let me just go to those. Can I have the speaker?
Oh, here.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, sir.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me?
Please turn it on.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah, good evening, Council President Hunt and Councilmember Walsh. I'm Alan Quinn, Senior Stormwater Engineer for the city. Apologize for getting here a little late. Had the time wrong, apparently. Yeah, just to speak to your question. So, yeah, so the Newport Way water quality retrofits, yeah, you're correct. So the Newport Way corridor project, there's several phases, right? So there's the project portion that's west of SR 900, and then the portion east of 900 to Sunset. And so I was able to talk to our transportation engineer who's managing that project and get a better understanding of when those phase projects will be coming in. And so the earlier phase of the Newport Way corridor project, that's the portion from, I think it's at Maple to Sunset. So that's that's going to happen sooner. I'm not sure that's being teed up in the next couple of years. And what we're finding with that project after a little more research was that as part of that project, the transportation is going to do a major upgrade to that street, and they're going to be adding several lanes, which I believe is going to end up triggering stormwater treatment for the entire roadway. So typically, if they do a smaller scale project, they're adding just 1 lane. If they don't trigger a certain threshold, they only have to treat what they're adding essentially. But in this case, they're doing so much of an impervious area. They're adding so much roadway. They're going to trigger a full treatment of that roadway. Any is part of their project. So the intent with these retrofits was to piggyback on their project and to go above and beyond and treat the whole roadway more than just what the transportation project is required to treat. In this case, they're going to be treating a whole roadway as part of the project, so there's no point in, if it's being done by others as a requirement for that project, we didn't want to include it. Now, the other phase, later on, the phases that are the portion of Newport Way west of SR 900, that's further down the road, and it's not, we're still not clear what all that's going to involve, but that may not trigger the full-blown roadway improvements that we're thinking of, major, corridor improvements. So that's why that's still there as more of a placeholder, I guess, until that gets more finalized down the road. But that's quite a ways out, as I understand it. So.
Great. So syncing with the transportation projects and only doing what is necessary rather than doing something now that would potentially need to get torn up later.
Yeah, correct. As I said, we don't want to. There's no point in doing addition, there's nothing to do there, because transportation is gonna do the full treatment anyways, as part of that project, that earlier phases of the Newport Way Corridor project. So, as I said, west of there, it's not, I don't think they've fully fleshed out what they're gonna do. And so I'll be, obviously coordinating with transportation as well on all these projects, and where there's synergy, we can work together, but that's ideal situation, so. And I believe that's one of the requirements or metrics we looked at was, how does it fit into other scheduling of other, of the primary transportation. So, and any other agencies, WashDOT, et cetera, which I'll get into in a bit here, so.
All right. So then on to the next slide, please. So this then goes to our final 10 CIP list for you. As you can see, there's a few more habitat projects that supplanted the water quality, and we still have some major water quality and flooding items in the Old Town area. And then the basins, as you notice, that we have Issaquah, Schneider, Tibbetts, Park Hill, Laughing Jacobs, and Lewis, and then a citywide effort. So again, we're hoping, again, nothing wrong again with that first, the original 10, but again, what we're feeling is better with kind of what Alan talked about after looking at this, better coordination, but also more robust project types and more robust basin areas. Keeping in mind that those other projects, like Alan said, will be coming later because they are good projects. All right, and with that, Alan is gonna run through quickly just the concepts for our 10. And again, we are looking for the methodology that I just talked about, any feedback you had on that as one of your feedback items. And I know we've talked a little bit about that, but then again, just your feeling on these projects themselves and if there's any issues that you see with those individual projects coming up. Thank you very much. Alan. Great,
all right. So this is our final list, the 10 priority projects, and I guess Gary's done a great job talking through how we came up with that list. As you can see, a nice mix of projects. We have a few habitat projects in there, which was great, and talked about those, and water quality, of course, and then flooding projects. So let's go to skip to the map, I guess.
Yeah, maybe 2 slides ahead.
There you go. Perfect. So here's a map showing geographically the first project, SY, we're calling SY-2, Old Town Targeted Basin Study and Plan. So this project rose to the top pretty quickly, among all the projects we looked at. It rose to the top consistently, and realizing it's a priority, and there's such a diverse issues here that initially our consultant OTAC looked at specific projects, but it became we just realized there's too many things to address here with flooding, primarily flooding, conveyance systems that are outdated, and so it's a complex because it interacts with the Issaquah Creek, and that creates adds to the complexity of what we have to do there. So really, this is a study, essentially. A project to study in detail, really a comprehensive suite of projects to address the myriad of issues we have in this basin of Old Town. And it's really looking at a combination of flow control, managing flooding, water quality, and conveyance. As I said earlier, we have old infrastructure. It's the oldest infrastructure in the city. It's woefully inadequate capacity-wise, and it's failing. So we're going to focus. The priority number 1 project is this basically a study. In addition, it's King County, as Gary discussed earlier. King County's doing a flood study remap of the whole of Issaquah Creek, and we've been working with them and coordinating with them to sort of use the information that they're going to develop as part of that project to develop modeling and so forth, and looking at climate change, precipitations, and so forth to really nail that down. Now, we also, next slide. However, there's a more specific project within that project we're calling the Old Town Regional Flow Control and Water Quality Facility. And this is really to do something, and yes, we have to do this bigger study, but we also recognize what we know for sure what we're going to need to do is some regional facility to handle, really the flooding issues that we're having. And it's going to have to be a regional facility that can address not just the flooding, but also the issue of having the redevelopment of Old Town. As you know, there's zoning in there. We have streets that have 90%, 95% impervious zoning, allowable zoning coverage. And so now's the time to really work to develop a regional facility that, instead of doing a piecemeal where we're just, site by site putting in these small facilities that we have to maintain, let's look at a regional facility that we can tie into and treat it all and not have to, it's much more efficient, obviously. So that's, once again, involved, property acquisition potentially and other things, where we want to, where we're going to site this facility in the best location. But it's going to be, I need to be a thoughtful process. So next slide. And SP 228, this is a 229th Avenue Southeast Water Quality Improvement Project. And this is a project that's over by what we call the North Fork of Issaquah Creek. And not far from operations facilities. And this is an issue that's been going on for many years. It's basically a gravel area that's receives runoff from the 229th. When it rains, it gets inundated, muddy, and you have a lot of turbid runoff into discharging it to the North Fork of Issaquah Creek. And the city, we've looked at this, Stormwater's looked at this in the last couple of years, but it's really a tricky one because it does involve a little bit of work with WashDOT. It's in their limited access right away, some of it, but we really need to come up with a solution to address that. Again, I would address water quality, total suspended solids, which is an issue in that creek. Next project.
I think there's a question on that project,
Yeah.
if you wouldn't mind, Council
Sure.
President Walsh.
Yeah. So is that parking lot, or whatever you want to call it, you said part of it was in WashDOT's right of way. Who owns that?
Yeah, so it's a private parcel. I believe it's a good question. Actually, Matt's on on this as well. Yeah, Matt and I actually looked at this a couple years ago. I believe it's a private parcel, but there's also some parts of it are limited access. It's not defined. There's portions of where we would do the improvement of the work would be involved in the limited access right of way of WashDOT. So I think it's a combination of private ownership and limited access, WashDOT limited access right of way. So
then my question is, why is this a city project?
Well, because as I said, it's not all of it is private property, and it is city property, but I guess it's within limited access. And so, I mean, that's a good point. We would have to consider thinking about how we would involve others. But I think it's a combination of private and city and WashDOT. So it's,
Can I add one?
yeah.
Right, that's a great question. I think just as you remember back, one of the parameters were partners and other opportunities. So what we will, with that question, what we will come back with for the final on all of these projects is look at who are the funding partners, because that would be another of the adaptation management. That, right, we are not going to be looking at funding costs that really aren't ours. Right, we may have partners. These are all great projects, but that's a missing link right now that we haven't reached out and confirmed that yes, they're interested in doing that, but that's an important part. So that could be something that could change some of the projects going forward. But what you see right now, this ranks up there as an issue to be solved, and we're hoping that because we've identified it, because it's going to be improved, that our partners will join us and contribute the appropriate amount.
And just one quick thing I want to add. So the water that is entering into that area, so it's city stormwater. I mean, it's coming from city right of way, and that's really what's causing the issue. It's sheet flowing and discharging into that gravelly area and causing the erosion. So, I mean, the city, we need to come up with a method to control that runoff or do some type of treatment before it even gets to that area. So yeah, city water.
In general, it sounds like a necessary project. I just think we need to understand how much of that is a city requirement versus landowner and what we can do as far as understanding that.
And Council President Walsh, Matt's on. I know one of our consultants turned her camera on, so perhaps they have additional information to add. Matt, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. Matt Ellis, Utility Engineering Manager. And yeah, Alan and I have been working on this for a couple of years, and a third of that parking lot is city property, and then 2/3 is private. But as Alan said, a good portion of city runoff enters that parking lot. So it's in our best interest because how close it is to the North Fork of Issaquah Creek, we need to address it. So the portion where we would do the treatment would be on city property.
Yeah, and the solution that Matt and I were looking at was, involved conveyance and diverting flows in a different area, different part of the stormwater system, and that would involve going into WashDOT limited access. So that's why some coordination with WashDOT would be required if we wanted to go one route versus another route. So,
Did that answer your question, Council President? Great, thank you. You
Yep,
can
thanks.
move on.
good. All right, next one, Issaquah Hobart Road fish barrier removal. So this project came in, later on, as Gary mentioned, as part of the further refining our list. And this is a habitat project. It's a fish barrier removal project. So it's basically a culvert that's failing with a barrier, like a 4-foot barrier downstream of the culvert. It's on WashDOT's list of fish barriers as a full barrier. And so we wanted to get that in there, add it in there as a project to put in a new culvert crossing there, get rid of the barrier, as well as do as restoration downstream to Issaquah Creek. And it does go through the Squaw Valley, I believe, North Park. So we do own the property downstream. And upstream is, it's a riparian corridor area. There's a church there on the south side of the creek. So we felt that was a good candidate. And like I said, we address the WDFW's fish passage. It's on their list of culverts to be replaced. So SL6.
Council President Walsh has a question on that one.
Sorry.
I know the Sycamore area down there has a lot of risk of flooding and everything. I assume this project, would it have benefit toward that, or would it actually speed water through?
Well, yeah, good question. So as part of the design, we have to look at downstream impacts, right, and to make sure we mitigate those in some fashion. If we're gonna, there's things we can do to slow down velocities, but yes, that's a good point. We'd have to look at how to minimize downstream impacts as a result of opening up that culvert. Correct.
Well, I will just add, I had emailed a question to Gary about Sycamore flooding because I didn't see a project to address that on this list. And so I thought maybe you could clarify too that there's a current project to address Sycamore flooding. That's why that isn't on this list. But
Yes,
there's
that's a
current
great
CIP.
point. And that's something, again, we could maybe put in a reference when we come back next time to show what's already on the CIP. But yes, we're working, and again, I'm bringing back the county again, as they really seem to be able and willing partners. But we're looking at a way to reduce flooding and bank erosion in that area. County is also interested in looking at the condition of their current revetments in the area. There are about 4 revetments that they own and operate or maintain in that area. So we're looking at together. We've actually have a grant application, and we're looking to get funding to investigate them more, along with East Fork in that area. So very hopeful. So that is why you don't see those 2 on the list.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think when this comes back to council, that would be helpful because it's one of the areas
Yes.
where people do experience that flooding, and it would be good to explain what the city is doing for that.
Thank you.
Right. Next project.
And we've got about 15 minutes
Okay.
left. just
Yeah,
you're
so
aware.
SL6, Mammoth Cove Park and in-stream habitat enhancement project. So this is a project once hitting habitat, primarily fish habitat, essentially doing some downstream work in the channel. And that would be in conjunction, or as part of what I think Park Department is looking at doing for a planting project in the park as part of their planning effort. And then also involve coordination with WashDOT as they move forward with their culvert replacement projects of Snyder Creek. That's a Snyder Creek crossing there. So yes, once again, working in conjunction with others and trying to, piggyback and continue the good work that others are doing, particularly with, WashDOT doing the improvements upstream of a new culvert crossing there, and then we would then do some channel improvements downstream. So that's what that project is about. Newport Way, or that's one, okay, well, Newport Way, water quality retrofit 1, we already talked about that. Any questions? I think we discussed that earlier, so. East Lake Sammamish Parkway water quality retrofit, another water quality retrofit project. This time it will be on East Lake Sammamish Parkway, treating high use, pollution generating surfaces along East Lake Sammamish Parkway, which is a high use, high traffic area. So that would really be a lot of bang for the buck. There's currently no treatment there, so this would be a great, I think, great location to retrofit for stormwater treatment. Southeast, I'll show you next slide. Southeast 43rd Way roadway stormwater treatment retrofit. So this is in the Laughing Jacobs Creek Basin, which is a kokanee, a ground zero for kokanee for the city, and we're working with Trout Unlimited to do several projects in Laughing Jacobs, including some channel improvements for Laughing Jacobs Creek with Trout Unlimited. This is on along Southeast 43rd Way, and this actually came out of this City of Sammamish's Laughing Jacobs Creek Basin Plan, which we're partnering with them on. And so their consultant, Geosyntec, did a basin study and came up with projects, and we're basically piggybacking on their study, and what they looked at as good candidate projects to do treatment, and this is one of those that came out of that. Okay, what's the next one here? SP 32, Westlake Sammamish Parkway water quality retrofit. This would be doing some flow control and water quality treatment along Westlake Sammamish Parkway. This was something that we decided on this one because it really fit well with WashDOT, and we do have coordination meetings with WashDOT every 2 weeks, and I had discussed with them, based on their timing of the Lewis Creek Culvert Replacement Project at I-90, this is something that would make sense to do some treatment along the city right-of-way of Westlake Sammamish Parkway. While they're doing their project, they're going to have this part of the street torn up. And so that would be a great time to then put in some treatment facilities there, because they're not going to treat it, but but we would go in there and treat it while they're doing all their work. So it's a great opportunity to coordinate with them and do that work. And okay, and I think this is the last one here. SY4, programmatic fish barrier inventory removal. So this is one where we wanted to really come up with a program to thoughtfully strategically look at all of the fish barriers we have in the city. And we wanted to do one project, get that started, and that was the Hobart Road one, because we know that was a known fish barrier, but then really looking at all of our fish barriers and coming with the process for prioritizing them and putting them in an implementation schedule to replace over the next several years. So that's really what that is, and that's really working with Trout Unlimited and the county, and there's a group there that actually will assist the city in going out and doing assessment of these fish barriers. So once again, trying to work with others, and they've been a great partner. Trout Unlimited has been a great partner for the city. And then I think that's really it. This is an extension of that project, just more description of what we're seeing. And actually, that's a picture of the Hobart Road one that you're looking at there. These all are from the Hobart Road barrier. So you can see, it'd be nice to get that fixed.
All right. Thank you, Alan. That was a great list of projects. And we're back to the direction. Again, if there's any other questions on specific projects, that's great. We're also, again, looking for your comments on the methodology so that we could then come back the next council meeting with the finished plan, and have a little bit more detail. Again, we would come back with more detail on all of the projects if you do want us to go forward with that. But I'll just open it up for questions now.
Thank you. Any questions?
No questions, just comments, I guess.
Okay, great. I think I asked my questions as we went along, so I will at this time just check in with the city clerk if there are any individuals who have called in that might want to make public comments on this item.
I see no virtual hands raised at this time, Chair Hunt.
Okay, then I will also note for the record that there are no members of the public in the audience this evening at this time. So we will go now to the committee deliberation and recommendation. So Council President Walsh.
Yeah, I think this is fantastic, seeing it as it progresses through, seeing all of the community engagement that came into this, using the information from ecology, talking to the county about ways that they can help, understanding how this relates to our transportation projects. There are so many things that have come into this, and it's clear when you're talking that through, and I hope to see that in that final report and plan. When you're talking about the methodology, I think it's great to talk about, you know, these were the ones that scored highest. I would just, you know, I don't mind swapping those out given the explanation. I think without the explanation on those particular projects, not just, like, I think it's important to not just talk about we wanted to add diversity of projects and add diversity of regions, but also, and these ones were pulled out because of those reasons. I think also for community transparency, for somebody who's reading this, understanding what those scores were or how they were come into it. I think that was one thing that was really nice looking at the climate action plan, was seeing the actual scores that everything got. And so I'm not sure if that is something that is possible or planned, but that does give a sense of weight of a project, relative weight, to give an understanding of, for, you know, council or somebody who's funding this in the future, how important that is compared to others. But overall, I mean, looking at this, I think it's a great set of projects. I had questions about the parking lot, and so understanding that would be great. I think council will probably have questions about how it relates to the CIP and whether or not that replaces existing projects, or, and as you've said, it doesn't, but also how many of these will end up on the CIP coming forward, and how many will maybe wait until you have more information from potential funders, or all of that. So getting some of that clarity out, I think, would be really important. Overall, I really like what's coming out of this, so really pleased with everything.
Similar feedback from me. I appreciate the transparency and the methodology and the documentation of the process, you know, the filters that you used and the way that you then applied additional filters. And I do agree with Council President Walsh. It would be nice to see that additional level of detail, but I do think the way it's laid out here, it does give transparency into the thought process, and I think that is important. These are big projects. They will be big dollar amounts. So having that documentation of the process to how we got to those specific projects is really important. I think there's also a lot to like here in terms of the habitat projects and the benefits to fish, salmon, which are so important to the Issaquah community. I was also interested to hear that we are working with University of Washington Tacoma on the 6 ppd, or the tire dust pollution issue, that I think would be interesting for our community to know that we're working on that issue in our stormwater master plan, but also working on better understanding what can be done, because this is an issue where there's new science, and the science on the treatment especially is evolving. Okay. So that's great to know. And then I also thought, when this comes back to council, I think it would be important, maybe on a map or some visual way, to show where the existing projects and these projects fit in, because as I mentioned before, my first thought looking at this was there were only 2 projects that were flooding, and one of them wasn't Sycamore, and Sycamore is one of the areas of town that experiences flooding. And so just explaining that we are addressing the flooding issues in particular, which do affect a number of people in our community that we are addressing those, maybe not in this list, but if not in this list, then through the existing projects. So I think that would be helpful to lay out in a clear way, possibly with a map. But yeah, I think the list is great, and I think I think the methodology is clear. With a little bit more information, that would be just that much better. So with that, I'll recommend that staff move forward with the 10 capital improvement plan projects as presented. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And Chair Hunt, would you like to see this on consent or on regular business?
I think it's a big plan, and so I think regular business is probably the right place. What do you think?
I think it's non-controversial. I would say consent, but does the administration have a recommendation?
I think we would agree that it's non-controversial. I think one of the reasons we have the committee process is to go through the details, and I think your colleagues continue to demonstrate pretty great competence in the work of the committee, so we'd be happy to have it on consent.
Okay, I think, so I, as I indicated, I would be also fine with consent, so I think we can put it on consent. It would be great to have those additional materials in the packet, and then if council members have questions, they can
always
either
pull
refer
it.
to this meeting or refer to that packet, so that would be great.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you for the clear direction on the changes that you want. It's incredibly helpful to hear.
awesome. Well, thank you again. So with that, we will now move to ID 1157, Title 18 Land Use Code, follow-up items. And this will be presented by the Long Range Planning Manager, Stephen Padua, and I think also Director Dollywall, who may be on the line. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair Hunt. Director Dollywall might be having some problems connecting. She is traveling internationally, so what we may do is postpone the subdivisions topic until the end of the presentations, give her a chance to still get connected. And so I'm joined tonight by our consultant, Katie, who's with BHC. She'll be presenting on the bucket 4 follow-up items. And then Chris, can I share? Do I have sharing rights? Okay, can everybody see the presentation? Yes. So tonight we are seeking feedback from the committee members on several items from buckets 3, 4, and 5. What we are hoping to get from the committee members is specific feedback on the policy questions and options that will be presented tonight. Because we have several items tonight, what I'd like to ask is if we could do deliberations after each topic instead of waiting until the very end. Is that okay, Chair Hunt?
I think that is okay. The one challenge is the public comment, but I think then we can probably, if there's a good general stopping point, then I can do the public comment, and then we can do the deliberations as we go.
Great, yeah. Just let me know when to stop at any time. Katie, we'll start with your presentation.
I will actually just check in if there are any members of the public on the line, because if there aren't any public comments, there is. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, am I clear to go?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight, commissioners. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. We were asked to help provide some additional research on several topics that were brought to you previously that you felt needed additional analysis and research. The memo that's in your packet addresses all of those 15 or 16 items. And tonight we'll be talking about just 6 of the areas where we were hoping to get some additional policy direction and discussion. So go ahead and advance to the next one. The first topic that we wanted to talk about was rooftop screening. So this has to do with screening mechanical HVAC equipment that's placed on the top of roofs. The code currently has language, I'm just going to read it exactly so I don't get it wrong, that mechanical equipment must be screened from views above and at ground level, surrounding streets and surrounding buildings. So that statement has been taken to mean that since it needs to be screened at an above ground level, that all parts, including the top of the mechanical, and the comment was that sometimes that just doesn't work, either because of the equipment, the ventilation doesn't work when it's covered, or it's overly burdensome. So we tried to think of different options or look into this a little bit more and whether that is asking too much, and then to think of some options that would achieve the same desired outcome. So you can go ahead, next slide, please. So in thinking about rooftop equipment, essentially the screening requirements are trying to protect the aesthetics from the public realm, which is the sidewalk and public areas. So one option to make it more clear what's required for these rooftop mechanical equipment screenings would just be to say if any part of the equipment is visible from the sidewalk, whether it's the sidewalk of the building or maybe an adjacent sidewalk that may go uphill that would afford a view of the top of the equipment, any area visible from the sidewalk would need to be screened so that it's not visible. That would be one option. That would kind of define the view origin that we're trying to protect, and provide some flexibility. You know, if a building is very tall and not at all viewable from the sidewalk, that equipment could just have side screening, for example. Another option would be similarly, we would be choosing to prioritize the views from, we could build on that from the sidewalk and from anywhere visible from the second floor. So that would protect views of these mechanical equipment from one level up, but maybe not from, you know, levels 3 through 10, where one might expect to be able to see all sorts of things if you're in a tall building. A third option would be that this type of, and again, we're not talking about, we're just talking about the top screening. I think in most cases, the side screening would always be required to protect visibility, but only to require that top screening in residential and mixed use zones. So that would be where the views could be seen by residents that may have a higher priority for view protection. And then finally, a fourth option would be if your building is shorter than the maximum height, then you have to screen the top, because it's likely that there will be a building above you that can look down on you. But if you're hitting that max top level of the height, you don't have to screen the top of the mechanical equipment. So those are 4 options. There's more details of pros and cons in the memo, but those are the options that we're bringing to you today.
So I think since we do have a member of the public, if we can go through the topics and do questions, and then we'll go through and do our deliberation after that.
So go through all 6 topics now?
Yes, yeah, and we'll ask questions as we go, but I don't think we have questions on this one. Actually, I will ask a quick question. I believe the recommendation from staff on this one is the first one, is that correct? The just screening visible from the sidewalk? There is a staff recommendation on this item, I believe.
Katie, you're muted.
I'm not sure if you're speaking, but if you are, we can't hear you.
Katie, you may need to turn off your video. You seem to be having a bandwidth problem. Yeah.
Hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Okay, that's strange. So you had asked what the staff recommendation was on that one, and I'm just looking back at our memo. I don't think we had a recommendation. But I think if I had to make a recommendation now off the fly, I think that the way that the code is written, I think it is intending to protect views from the public areas. So I would prioritize the sidewalk and maybe either I think the most protective would be the protecting views for the sidewalk, number 1, and also number 4, which is requiring screening if it's a building that's below the maximum height limit of the zone. So it would be a combination of those two.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we can move on to the next one. So this one addresses requirements that multifamily buildings need to have at least 40% transparency of the first 5 feet above the floor, the floor elevation. And also another requirement that says that windows need to be above 6 feet from the floor elevation. And we recognize that's a conflict, because when you put those two together, only the top 1 foot would be available for screening or for transparency, excuse me. So the purpose of putting the windows above 6 feet above the surface of the sidewalk would be, so sorry, let me say one more requirement. The base floor elevation of the residential unit needs to be 18 feet above the exterior grade. So the sidewalk is the exterior grade. The floor level needs to be at least 18 inches above the sidewalk, and then the windows can start 6 feet above the sidewalk. Sorry. There's a lot going on here. There's a helpful picture in your memo that helps to sort it out. But essentially, we're trying to figure out how to reconcile the need for transparency on these facades that are in some of the more pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods, and also the privacy of residents and wanting to have eyes on the street for public safety. So go to the next slide. So what we've proposed, one option would be to blend these two regulations together to essentially say that you need to have your windows at this higher level and you need to have transparency, but that transparency will only apply to portions of the window that are basically at the residential unit. We're not going to require windows to be way up high on the wall. And I'm not sure if you can flip to the page of the memo, but we have a picture that tries to illustrate that. Basically, we're trying to achieve the initial intent of the regulation, but revising it to meet this condition. And then another option would be if the council feels that these ground level transparency requirements are too onerous, we can remove them for multifamily uses or reduce them, or similarly remove or reduce the height placement requirement for windows. I will just clarify that this is a condition that only exists when residences are right directly at the sidewalk. So where a multifamily building is set back 5 feet or even less than 5 feet, these do not apply. So in those cases, windows could be at the ground level. There would be an opportunity there to put screening for vegetation or other types of architectural features. And then, so the second option would be to change those requirements, and the third would just be to reduce the transparency standard. We heard from at least one commenter that having so many windows on a residential facade could not be desirable for residents. So we can go on to the next one. View preservation. So this has been a topic that we've kind of been working on, but haven't found a solution to yet. It was initially on the whiteboard, but we were asked to bring it back and talk about it now. The feedback we got was that the draft language, which is carrying over the existing language mostly, is too vague, and we need some ideas. So we looked at different peer cities that had view protection programs. We looked at Vancouver, BC, we looked at Seattle, we looked at Redmond. And I think the major difference between Issaquah's view protection program and these cities is that all of these other cities had really clearly defined view origins and view destinations and corridors that connected those two. Issaquah's language names certain areas that want to be protected, the views of the Issaquah Alps, views of forested hillsides, and some others, and that they should be protected from public spaces, but that really is too vague and could apply so broadly that it's challenging to know. It would be challenging to know where development would be allowed if we're trying to protect those views from so many places. So our recommendation is that we do go ahead and have a study and a process with the community that would identify those locations that want to be protected, those corridors, and have a map that would show those areas, and then specifically describe what the types of protection were, what those standards would be. So that is a more of a medium or long-term goal. But for an interim option, one potential option would be to keep the draft language as it is, as a good framework for what the city is trying to achieve. But for each development where we feel views could be impacted, require a developer to do a view impact study. That would basically be a micro scale of this citywide view study that I suggested earlier. Another option would be to take out those view protection language standards for now until a better view protection program can be put in place. This would remove that ambiguity. And then the third option would just be to keep it as it is and try to work with it as staff has been doing so far. And next slide, please. So we received a comment that food waste chutes, specifically waste chutes that would be in a multifamily building, could be problematic and could lead to sanitation issues and burdens for maintenance. I did want to clarify that right now, as the code is written, waste chutes are not required, but there are standards. If they are used, they must meet certain standards. So we looked into this. You can go to the next slide, and we came up with some options that would try to address these sanitation concerns. One option would be, if the chutes are used, have them be separate for garbage and recycle, but not allowed a compost, a food waste chute. So that would mean that garbage bags and recycling, which are typically cleaner if they can be contained in a bag, could be sent down the waste chute into a garbage collection room, but that would not be allowed for food waste. Another option would be, similarly, if the chutes were used, have three separate options. You could have one for food waste, but there would be some additional maintenance requirement and code enforcement language added. So the first one is just 2 waste streams, not compost. The second option would be all 3, but extra mitigation for the food waste chute. And then the third one would be to prohibit food waste chutes, but instead require food waste just to be collected in a secure, accessible area. Next one, please.
We have a question on this one, if you could pause, please,
Sure.
Council President Walsh.
Yeah. Is there a way to allow chutes, but if a chute isn't used, to require collection areas and secure and accessible areas? And by secure and accessible areas, does that mean on each floor in neighboring areas where a chute would be, or could it be on the main floor?
I don't think we've added that level of information, but I think I'm understanding your question correctly. We could allow them as an option. And if it's not chosen as an option, still require food waste collection in a garbage room. And I'm not sure if apartment buildings usually have garbage rooms on each floor. I'm more familiar with them on one floor. And that would make sense for the chutes going down into a centralized collection area. But I'm not 100% positive if, there could be large buildings where it makes sense to have more than one garbage room. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. So in my mind, that would be kind of option 4, which is if chutes are used, require garbage and recycle, and then require either a food waste chute or a separate collection in an accessible area. Does that make sense?
Yes, it
Okay.
does. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, you can proceed, thanks.
Okay, so we also received a comment about rooftop materials and specifically sustainable materials and what that means, because in code and also the climate action plan has called for rooftop materials to be sustainable materials. So we've added a definition of sustainable materials, which is in the memo, but we also wanted to do a little research on what rooftop materials are currently required, specifically by the central Issaquah architectural standards, and whether those meet the eco-friendly sustainability goals. And what we found was that some of them, specifically asphalt shingles that are required for craftsman style buildings, are not considered sustainable materials. They are, since they're a petroleum product. So we've come up with some options to try and address these conflicts between the design manual and the sustainability goals. One option would be to provide flexibility for the roof material required by the architectural design manual if the sustainability, if that required material isn't considered sustainable, that they would be able to have an exception to that rule, that essentially they would be able to use the asphalt shingles in certain situations. We could also, another option would be to change the craftsman style requirements to another material that would be considered more sustainable. We did some research on specific alternatives and we found some, but I think that we didn't feel it was appropriate to name a specific product because technologies are changing so rapidly, and we didn't want to be stuck with a material that may not continue to be used or preferred. And then another option would be if you use asphalt shingles, for example, and there's no other alternative that works, you need to provide other types of green enhancements to the project, such as solar panels or enhanced stormwater treatment or some other mitigation that would offset the use of that material. Next slide, please. Oh, and finally, we were asked to provide some options for an alternative to the multifamily medium / Old Town Zone. So we've come up with these 3 options that we could consider. They're a little bit shorter, and these would apply only to that medium density zone in Old Town. And I believe that's my last slide.
Okay, thank you. Since we do have a person waiting on public comment, if we can go through all of the presentations and then we will go through and make our comments. And I recognize that is a bit difficult, but to keep the order in the agenda, that would be great. So thank you.
Of course, thank you, Katie. So for the next item, we're going to look at bucket 5, specifically on parking. The committee members requested that we come back with additional language to clarify how the new regulations or the proposed regulations are different from the existing regulations. The feedback was specifically on what we took from the ITE parking generation manual and how that's different from existing regulations, or how they might be a little bit different compared to existing projects. So two attachments were provided with the memo. The first being project examples. We took 5 projects in Issaquah to show how the proposed regulations might impact if we were to redo those projects again, and we presented the net effect or anticipated net effect from those existing projects. The other attachment B, I'm not going to go specifically through all of them because there's a lot, but we did go through each of the land uses to show peer city review to see how other cities might have their parking regulations for those specific land uses, but also show the anticipated effect from the proposed regulations for tier 1 and tier 2 areas, and that being the higher density areas versus the lower density areas. So the options that are being offered for discussion tonight, the first is to keep the draft changes as proposed. The second option is to look at keeping the maximums as proposed, but potentially removing the minimum requirements for the tier 1 land uses, which results in a neutral decrease impacts for tier 1. And that is consistent with a lot of the goals and outcomes that were discussed for parking with the committee, as well as what would be consistent with many of the parking studies and discussions that we've had as part of this project. So now, Chris, can you confirm if Director Dhaliwal was able to join us? I can't see it from where I'm at.
Yes, Stephen, I do not see her as a panelist, and I've not gotten any messages from her.
Okay, so I will get started with the subdivisions chapter. Katie will join me in helping field any questions that you might have on this topic. Otherwise, we can continue on with the discussion if that is okay. Okay, so this follow-up is from bucket 3 from the Title 18 project. It was specifically asked from the committee to go back to the Planning Policy Commission to get further feedback on subdivisions, specifically on block length and zero lot line development. So the feedback received was that we wanted a little more discussion from the Planning Policy Commission on this topic because it has a huge impact on major development throughout the city. And so the staff recommendation going to the Planning Policy Commission was to recommend maximum block length of 250 feet, specifically just for Central and Highlands and Tallis neighborhoods. For zero lot line, the recommendation was to allow zero lot line in Central, Highlands, and Tallis, and single family zones that have a minimum dwelling unit per acre 7.26. And the recommendation from the Planning Policy Commission was essentially the same, but they added actually additional consideration for zero lot line, which is to look at design standards to maintain design characteristics for each of the neighborhoods, to allow zero lot line specifically only for Central Highlands and Talus. So I'd like to open the floor if there's any questions on this item. Okay. So that concludes our presentation. Jump ahead. Next steps is for the Planning Policy Commission to have public hearings on the consolidated draft for Title 18, and then start the City Council review in December. The next topic coming to the committee will be Bucket 6, Procedures and Administration on September 22nd.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions? Okay. Then we'll now move to public comments on this item. So check in with the city clerk, and then if there is a member of the public, I will read some directions for public comment.
Chair Hunt, I do not see any virtual hand raised.
Okay, maybe I'll just give it a minute since we do have it. And then I will note also there's nobody in the audience this evening. Okay. Well, then we'll move to our deliberation. So if we could do this by going back through the slides, I think that would be helpful. And then that will also give us a visual of the different options for each topic, and we'll try to tick through them and ask any questions as needed. So I think the first ones were back on screening and okay. Thank you. I did have a question on this. So the sidewalk level and then the max height between 1 and 4, are there situations where you would require, which one is less prescriptive, or is it just different situations would require different screening?
So I think it would depend on the topography. The screening from the sidewalk level would probably have the broadest impact. And I think it's probably the easiest to apply and assess whether or not they've achieved it, because it can, you can walk around a building from the different sidewalks and envision and look up and see whether the materials are screened. The other options are really trying to zero in on certain populations or certain viewers that may be impacted by the site of the equipment. I think probably in terms of what's most prescriptive, and I think by that I'm hearing, it sounds like you're saying maybe most strict, would be probably number 4, because it would mean that any building that isn't built to the maximum height would need to screen the side and top of all of their equipment. And if you added that to, and probably that would, you added that with number 1, that would cover just about any opportunity that anybody would have to see that equipment. The other two, numbers 2 and 3, are trying to add a little bit more flexibility to not require as much screening for every circumstance.
Okay, so we did receive one comment on this, which was from Christy Triple of the Raleigh Properties, and she recommended option 4. And I think, to me, this is just, it's not particularly clear. And you just mentioned the topography, which would affect number 1. So I don't personally think that viewing of the equipment from these different levels is particularly important. So I guess I would give some flexibility in this area, and I'm not sure which one achieves that. do you have thoughts on this one?
Yeah. The users that I care about are the people that are in public spaces. And so the people that are walking around on sidewalks, in parks, things like that. For the most part, that means that as long as we're looking at not being able to see the top of the equipment from sidewalk level, that's what's important to me. If someone has a 3-story building and their stuff isn't visible from the sidewalk because it has the side screening, but there's a 5-story building next to it that chose to build to that height, that's okay to see the tops of those items from my perspective. So I'd rather give the developer the flexibility and the ventilation, the ability to do its job. So my preference is for option 1.
I think that all makes sense to me, and I'm also fine with option 1. Okay, so we can move on. Yeah, there's one other comment which maybe I can follow up with Director Dollywall, but it's about a particular requirement in this, a particular word in this code, so I'll follow up on that. Okay, we can go to the next one. So transparency, similarly, in my opinion, I think there can be flexibility here. I spoke last time about, maybe you want to have windows for cross ventilation. And so I'm in favor of not requiring this and allowing the building to be built to whatever the market is for this kind of design as a design aesthetic. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I actually agree with the staff recommendation that I think it's important to have visibility on the street, and considering this is only applicable for a multifamily that has a 0 lot line that doesn't have a setback, I think it sets the tone on the sidewalk in those cases, and it requires a developer to not have windows that are necessarily, going to be a privacy issue where somebody at street level is looking right in, which can feel very awkward for the person walking down the street. So my preference would be to go with option 1.
Okay, I'm also okay with option 1, especially given it is the staff recommendation. We can go on to the next one. View corridors.
I'll start with that. This is a big issue. I really appreciate all of the research on what some of the example cities are. I think we absolutely need to get a map, and we need to decide that our views are certain things and viewable from park locations. Without that, it becomes an absolute nightmare for code and trying to decide who can build what where. We could get into legal issues. I want to get away from that as much as possible, but I do recognize that this is a big thing that needs to go to a community conversation. So for now, I guess I would say option 1 or option 3. My concern with a view impact study for every development is just the cost of that, and not wanting that to be an additional burden that might increase the cost of housing.
I agree with all of that. I especially thought that Redmond, their approach would make sense in the long run, but we don't have the information to go with that approach currently. So given that, I was thinking option 3, because it seemed that we have this code, we know there are changes, but at least then we aren't putting in a interim code that has more requirements that we, again, know that we're going to be changing once we have information to go with a different approach. So in the long run, I think something similar to Redmond's approach would be best. In the short term, I think option 3, which is maintain the existing code, recognizing it has issues.
Yeah, did you have any comment on what the cost or understanding of the requirements of those impact studies would be?
We're not sure on the cost quite yet, but just to clarify on the options, we do have identified on the future updates list to look at view preservation. And so is the recommendation to not continue with that, or to continue, maintain existing code and still continue with that future update item?
Yeah, I think we're both very interested in having that as a future update and doing the work that's required, and probably preferring Redmond's model as a way to just jumpstart what we can do, but it's going to require a community conversation, so.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I will start us off on this food waste options one. So I personally think that composting is an important way that we can have an option for reducing our emissions as a city and waste, and it's definitely part of achieving our climate action goals. However, I did also view the composting facilities that service the city of Issaquah, and those service providers said, that one of their really big issues is contamination. And so if this, if allowing the chute and, for folks that aren't used to separating out their garbage recycling and their food waste, if this is going to be a big source of contamination, they actually specifically flagged that this was a concern. So they would rather have compost that's specifically all food waste and reduce that contamination, and then not have the cost, the back end of sorting out all of this plastic and other stuff that makes it in when people are not separating those things out. So based on that, I think not requiring it. I think if there's a development that wants to put in those facilities, I wouldn't want to preclude that, but I also would not want to require it. It also seems that it doesn't seem that there's a big call for this from the multifamily developers. So if we were to require it and you built the chutes and then it wasn't used, that's also not meeting our goals. So for those two reasons, I think allowing it, I would be fine with, and then but requiring it, I would not be supportive of.
So the option that I had presented was kind of an option 4, which was if chutes are used, require separate garbage and recycling. And then they can either do a chute for food waste or a separate collection area. I think that describes what you were talking about, which is don't preclude them from doing it if they want to, but if they don't choose to do a chute, they have to provide it in another way with a separate collection area.
So I agreed 100% up until that last point. The last point, though, is like that you have to provide it. I think we should check in with our compost service provider if this is something that they would have a major concern with, because my impression from doing this this tour of the facilities, which was probably about a year ago, was that they had concerns. So it'd be good to know those concerns before requiring it.
Yeah, and I think this would only require it if you're also adding chutes, if I understand that correctly. Because it's about the building space, not about what services you provide to your residents.
So to be clear, currently there are multifamily apartment buildings that don't have a food waste option. So that is one way to keep contamination out of the compost stream, basically. So that's the concern. So I would say, I think we agree on not requiring the separate chute and on all of that. And then if we could just check in with if we could check in with the compost provider if they have a concern about requiring it in one form or the other, that would be useful. And I think they may, based on my prior conversation with them.
Okay, I'm fine with that as going forward, just getting a little bit more information. But in general, yes, I think we agree, don't require it because of those concerns. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so my concern here is fire safety. I just want to make sure that by creating that's one of my concerns. I want to make sure that by asking people to use eco-friendly or requiring eco-friendly rooftops, that we're not precluding them or excluding their ability to choose something that's going to be fire safe for particularly our mountain and hillside areas. And then I guess I would say of the options presented, I prefer option 3, which allows the offsets. I think that's a creative way of managing things that let people utilize and understand what their particular circumstances are, but then require something as a mitigation.
So my understanding, so I went into this thinking I was supportive of option 1, but my understanding of option 3 is that it would provide alternative flexibility, but there are certain parts of the city that currently don't allow you, for example, to put a metal roof, which I think, I'm not an expert, but I don't think that's a fire hazard. It is metal. So I would think that providing flexibility for sustainable roof materials basically allows you to use those in those areas where they aren't currently allowed, and that would meet my goal, which is to just allow it, but also not be overburdensome.
So the way that I read option 1 was basically, here are all of the eco-friendly materials you should use, and here are some exceptions that we might say. That to me seems like it seems like we're cornering people into a certain type of material and then requiring an extra set of review if they're not using that. I guess that's kind of the same as 3. I'm just trying to understand how can we reduce the burden on CPD in doing that review.
Council President, Councilmember Hunt, it sounds like you want a 4. And so perhaps what we can do is we can take the comments that you're saying. I think you want to provide flexibility. You want there to be fire safety, but you don't want it to be overly onerous. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. And this is based too on the fact that I know there are some parts of the city where you can't use eco-friendly materials. So I would like to address that where you could use them, but not force.
But not be fire unsafe.
Not be fire unsafe and not require every building, for example, to have.
So I think what staff can take note of this conversation and come back with some language that reflects the committee's desires, because it's not quite 1, it's not quite 3. So we'll work on that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at them again. It really is sort of a flexibility between, it's something like between option 1 and 3, which is option 4. So thank you. Zoning name options.
Yeah, and I was trying to remember why this came up. It seemed like it was like a very similar name between this and another one. But I was looking over at the zoning map and all of the list, and I'm not finding what that was. So.
I did notice it was a comment from from you. I'll just say, I think Old Town neighborhood works, so I would go with that one. I mean,
Well, but it's the difference between, it's the multifamily section of that, and the Old Town is larger than just multifamily.
okay, so then can you refresh us on what are the other surrounding zones that we're trying to differentiate from?
So I think the other one is multifamily low, and I'll ask Katie to refresh my memory because I wasn't at the meeting. But I think it was just trying to distinguish between multifamily high, which was part of the discussion, I think where the comment came from Council President Walsh.
And I unfortunately don't have any additional information other than I think there was another zone in the city called multifamily medium dash something else. But I'm going to just take a quick look at the zoning map and see if I can refresh my memory.
Either way, I guess I would say I'm not an expert on this. I don't think I need to weigh in on which one it is. I think you guys can choose a zoning name. I just called it out because I saw two things that seemed very similar and I didn't want people to be confused. So if that feedback works for you, yeah.
Yes, that works for us. We'll take a look at it.
Okay, great. Can go to the next one. Oh, parking.
Happy to start. There was tons of information here. I love this. It was everything that I ever wanted, and I wanted to just sit in there and look and say, oh, look how different we are from Bellevue and Redmond and all of that. So I really, really appreciate it. I don't think there's much that we need to do at this point, given what the data shows in our comparison. I look forward to a community conversation about, what we're looking for with parking. But my actual only concern when looking at the information was the single-family detached for Tier 2. So when we're talking about Tier 2, that's our, not our core areas, not our Issaquah Highlands, not our more dense areas. And there is a 2 per unit max for those houses. And I feel like there's a fair number of single family homes that either are going to be developed or currently have a 3-car garage with a tandem. And so I just wonder whether that would be too restrictive for our community for the Tier 2 concept. So that would be the only one I would really call out. Otherwise, I just think this is a great set of data and looking into how we can adjust this in the future. And toward that idea, I think there was one instance where you looked at a duplex and provided the max option as a tandem space. So that could be another way that you could potentially look at it for a single family detached Tier 2 would be potentially a tandem space if we really felt like that was necessary.
Okay. So then, do you have thoughts on the keep draft changes as proposed or the keep maximum and remove the minimum, which is the bigger change?
I feel like we had already done a good job of adjusting the minimum downward, and so I wouldn't want to make that recommendation at this point before we have that future updates conversation. So I'm comfortable to keep the draft changes as proposed.
Okay. So when I looked at the table that has the increase, decrease, neutral, when I saw the number of increases, especially around retail, so this is an increase, as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, This is increasing, there were increases for retail, for example, number of different kinds of commercial, and with the new code, we're increasing the parking requirements from the existing code.
That's correct.
So to me, that was a red flag. And it seems like we want to at least be neutral or decreasing to reduce the, to be more pedestrian friendly, to achieve the goals in the climate action plan, to achieve our general goals with this update. So for me, I saw those and I was thinking, there's a fair number, especially with these commercial, that we're actually increasing the requirements. It feels to me like that was a red flag. And then there's this option presented to keep maximums and remove the minimums for tier 1, which would make everything neutral or decrease the impacts. So it seemed to me that that would be something we should consider.
I have some comments on that.
Okay.
I don't know why they're labeled as increase, because maybe it's the difference between the NSF and GFA. Yeah, so if you want to describe the difference between that, because otherwise it looks like, 2 spaces per 1,000 is the same as 1 per 500. So can you talk through the difference between those two?
Yes, so specifically on the items that show an increase, they are very minor increases, because we saw that as kind of a red flag for this conversation. Wanted to look at what is that, a 50% increase, or is it 1% increase? And it is actually a very small percentage, and it is because of the change from net to gross in that conversion when we were looking at the ITE parking generation manual. Does that help kind of address what that means? Okay.
Yeah, so from my perspective, when looking at that, the calculations net out that we're trying to aim for about the same thing, and we're still coming out, gobs ahead of Bellevue and Redmond and Linwood in some of these cases. And so I felt pretty comfortable that even though they are technically labeled as an increase, that it really isn't something that's seeing a huge increase.
Okay. I think this is the only one that we potentially might want to flag for council, because for me, we do have this next look at the parking, but if we could take this step in this update, and it's on the table and it achieves a number of goals from a number of plans, I think at the very least we should bring it to council as something that we had some different thoughts on, didn't have one, didn't have one clear option that we both felt was like the clear winner. So, okay. So yeah, I think on this one, for me, I like the idea of removing the minimums for the tier 1 land uses, but I do think it'd be good to better understand, because I was basing that on the number of increases. So if they're tiny, then that's also, I should go back and look at that.
So Chair Hunt, I guess a question for Stephen. So is the plan then to bring this updated analysis back to this committee before it rolls into the final draft document, or not?
Well, so that was actually going to be my question.
Okay, good.
On when would the committee like for us to bring this back? Because we have the consolidated draft public hearings. We'd like to try to get, if we want this change, we want to try to get that in there as part of the public hearings prior to bringing it back to the committee in December.
It sounds like you guys really need a decision in order to move forward on the draft.
Well, I mean, something we really haven't talked about is what the landing of all this looks like, because eventually there's going to be a document. This committee is going to go back to the council and say, here's a list, hopefully a relatively short list of policy questions. And so if this is one of those, I think that's perfectly fine. I think the question Stephen's asking is, do you want to have an intermediate discussion before that, so that you're informing the council, or we have information laid out for the council, or do you just want to, I mean, and I also think that before we go back to the full council, we're going to have to kind of bring you a draft report. I mean, a draft not only here's the draft document, but here's how we're going to step through it with the council. Because in essence, I think this committee is going to have to walk your colleagues through this. And so whatever we want to call that, outline, script, table, whatever it turns out to be, I mean, we're getting close to having to start talking about that. So in this instance, again, we can come back to the committee with more information that would be folded into what we take to the council, or we could wait until we're just about ready to go to the council and talk to you about how this ultimately gets presented and which particular sections we want to flag, and then what kind of discussion the committee wishes to walk through. Because I think the committee, your colleagues are going to be desperate for you to provide some insight on these harder parts. I mean, you've covered lots of ground. So, I mean, what's left is, if it's hard for you, it's going to be very hard for your colleagues. So I think whatever you like, we're happy to do.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would probably have labeled those as increase/neutral, and really just understand that just because the top table shows a bunch of increases, that it isn't because we actually increase the number just because of the GFA portion. And I guess I would just come back to the concept of parking is part of our future updates list. And one of those things was, should we remove minimum requirements? And so I think that, from my perspective, is really where that conversation lies. Particularly because as you look into the details of that, there isn't anything that I'm seeing jump up in parking compared to where we are.
Okay, one more question. It says in our packet that this keep maximums and remove minimums aligns with the city multimodal and growth goals for tier 1 areas. And so is it specifically in our multimodal plan that we would take this action and remove the minimums?
The action isn't, but it's consistent with what the mobility master plan is calling for
Yeah.
providing efficient use of the land use, specifically for multimodal modes, not specifically for parking. And it's consistent with what was called for from the parking study in terms of being more efficient with the parking existing more than trying to expand the parking for tier 1 areas. But this specific action isn't called out in any of the plans.
Yeah. It seems that this is, I guess I come back to, it seems that the way we're headed is to remove minimums to decrease the amount of parking. And so, yeah, go ahead.
So my thought is, I think that's a really important community conversation. And I would have a hard time going back to the council and telling them that we're recommending removing the minimum requirements for tier 1 land uses before we have that future updates conversation. I think that gets us into a position where we're making a fairly large change that some community members and the rest of the council may not be pleased with. So my preference would be that since this isn't increasing, I love that we have the data now. We can see all of that. I love that we're going to be able to, in that community conversation, talk about what the master mobility plan talks about and how this affects developers and how this affects, housing costs and affordability. I think there's a lot there. I'm just not quite ready to make the recommendation within this Title 18 big thing to remove minimum parking requirements.
Okay. And I think this, like the other items, it doesn't have a staff recommendation. It's for our discussion.
I think for staff, I think the recommendation is to go with number 1, primarily because we have that item on the future updates list to take a look at this. as part of community conversations, but also to get more technical analysis of, are those even the right numbers for the maximums, if that's what we want to stay with for Tier 1 areas?
Okay. Well, I think we should flag this for council consideration. I think it'd be good to maybe somehow quantify in the council presentation of this information the extent of the increase, so it doesn't look like we're increasing a bunch, because it does even have an increase neutral category. It doesn't use that except for a few. It uses a bunch of the increase. So yeah, if we could maybe quantify that a little more. But yeah, I guess it seems to me we're increasing a little bit a bunch of commercial uses parking requirements, which seems counter what we want. So I'm open to sticking with the draft changes, but I will at the very least want to flag this for council consideration.
Okay, we can do that.
Just one more question. I think it would be hard to, would it be hard to, for predictability, to use sort of like if our existing standard was a little bit lower, to use that standard? So basically to just kind of, for those ones, stick with what we had. I think it would be hard to hard to say in the documentation of our method why they would be, because it was based on the past.
Well, we already do that for some of the existing land use regulations for parking, for where a maximum and a minimum were already provided and gross floor area was used. There wasn't very many that did that, but we are kind of using the existing studies from when the central plan was put together and since then.
So what about maybe then using the lower of the two if they're close?
So I think the IT manual standardizes on gross floor area rather than, yeah. So when I'm looking through it, there is one instance where it says increase or neutral, which is the medical office. And the only difference between those is the NSF versus GFA. Same thing when you go down to the other ones that say increase. So really, really, truly in this, there's no instance where we're actually intentionally increasing the requirements. It's just with this transition. And so I think that really is just it's just a label that maybe was mistaken.
And we can certainly quantify that too when we present it to council, just to show what the difference would be with that conversion.
And again, I think as you prepare the package for the council, this is going to be flagged. And so I think as we will come back, I'm sure one last time, walk through what we plan to say. It's a big deal. This is a major part of this, and I think the committee's sensitive to the magnitude of this. You don't want to put a roadblock in any way moving forward with this, but you also don't want to go too far without a larger community dialogue. And so I think you could say all that as this gets presented to the council. If your colleagues disagree, I mean, that's the reason they ultimately have to approve this, then they can have more discussion with it. But I think from what you've said tonight, I think you've given us enough direction. We'll make sure as we package this up for the council, this will be flagged and you'll have one more pass at this before the council discussion.
Yeah, I guess what would be helpful, because I think to some degree it's a little bit apples and oranges. Like some of these, the existing standard is based on, I mean, just looking at one example, it's probably not the best, but one is based on like per beds, and then it's based on the square foot or GFA in a different standard. So, there's some apples and oranges. I think just to restate my general premise, I think we've heard and we have all these plans that talk about using our limited land efficiently and reducing the amount of surface parking lots in new development to provide a more walkable area, especially in the Central Issaquah plan, and then also in our multimodal plan and climate action plan. So that's my concern when I see this. The big concern is like all of these increases for commercial parking. So if we can better explain that, and then if it's not as big as, not a big an impact as it looks, or as my council colleague has described it, then that's okay. But the way it's presented here, it makes me nervous.
Yeah, and let me jump on that. I completely agree. I have no concerns about the areas that's NSF versus GFA, but if you would quantify the amount of increase on some of those where we're changing the kind of measurement technique, if those truly are significant increases or over a 10% increase, then instead of switching to no minimum requirement, I'd just say, hey, maybe those numbers that we calculated aren't the right fit for us right now. And of course, we'll look at that on the future updates, but I don't want to vote something in right now that's going to cause us an increase.
Well, and it sounds like it would be defensible if there is some where it's increasing, that we could go with the existing standard as the lower standard for those as an option, especially if we have that comparison. So I think that would be helpful. Does that give you what you need?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And you'll have one more touch before we go back to the council, just to confirm.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know we need to touch on this specifically, but I think what you're saying is we're going to get a bunch of things.
But there's the specific language, and then there's the broader issue. And I think we want to make sure that the committee is comfortable with how the broader issue is presented. And as you need to talk about specifics in order to talk about the broader issue, I think you've sorted through that tonight. So we can go from there.
Start out. You guys had great recommendations, and so did PPC. I agree with both of those recommendations for block length and zero lot line.
Okay. So I did have a question on the block length one. In our materials, it talks about that this is necessary to restrict to, or to only apply to Central, Highlands, and Talus, in part because of topography. And if you could explain that, that would be helpful.
I think what was intended to say with what was put in the memo was, for those areas, we have different zoning compared to the other parts of the city where we have the development agreements that push forward a little bit higher density. And so with those block lengths, it adds to what the intention was for adding pedestrian activity, shorter block lengths, so that you have more walkability, which is what was asked for those neighborhoods. And because we haven't gone through the neighborhood planning process for the other neighborhoods, that's why the commission didn't feel comfortable prescribing 250 feet for block length for the other neighborhoods. Does that answer your question?
So longer block lengths are more, the shorter block lengths are more compatible with the existing developments in these areas is sort of what you're saying.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of similar to the last one for this block length issue, that we do want to have our newer subdivisions with this more connected pattern. I think that one's the one that I have more concern about. The zero lot line, I can get behind the recommendation of the staff and the PPC. I was also at that meeting where they discussed, and they had a good discussion on it. I think it's important that we allow it where there are these smaller lots that could use this zero lot line form of development, which are in the family zones that have these characteristics or these areas plus this family zones that have a minimum dwelling unit per acre. I think essentially those are all the places in the city that would have these smaller lots that would be likely to use this zero lot line form of development. So I'm fine with that one. The block length one, yeah.
Ask a question on that. So living in the Highlands, this is absolutely essential. I love block lengths and being able to go in between, but that's only available if there's street connectivity on either side of that unit of housing. Is there a way that, much like with the zero lot line, they added in, and also single family zones that have a minimum of certain dwelling units, is there a way to require that if there is a certain level of like street density or the ability to connect through to something behind? Because like I know we have something that if you're building near a park, you're required to have connectivity in that way.
We can take a look at the draft language to see what might make sense, but in terms of the amount of street connectivity, it's not necessarily the amount of streets that we're looking for, it's more of the activity of what the land uses are in place. And so to your point of having connectivity for parks, we want to look at if allowed commercial or allowed retail uses nearby that would call for higher pedestrian activity for either through block passages or for the block lengths, so you can break it up a little bit more.
And if I might add to that, I think that the difference between requiring connections when a park exists is that it could be that short blocks exist all by themselves for a while until other short blocks are developed over time. So it's and that's why it's difficult to put this in place in existing neighborhoods, because they already have a established block pattern. So really these block lengths come into play when pieces of undeveloped property are being platted and there's an opportunity to establish smaller blocks.
So I'm trying to think of situations where that would be the case outside of Central Issaquah and the Highlands and Talus, where we already have the block links. In Central Issaquah, I can see the concept of, you've got an area, it redevelops, and you want to be able to go through. I guess, just trying to think other areas of the city, whether that would be important enough in order to really have a requirement on the developer that changes how they can develop on a property. I don't know, thoughts?
I mean, it doesn't, so it's a maximum. It doesn't stop you from, if there are connections, you can at least still build the smaller blocks and use those connections with the proposed code, as far as I understand it. So it's really just about allowing the much larger block lengths in certain neighborhoods. And then I found what I was referring to last time. So the con in our packet, the con of a maximum block length citywide is said to be, may not be possible to have maximum block length in all areas due to lack of connections, which is what you're talking about, due to lack of connections to existing streets, or there may be topographic challenges. So lack of connections, I get. I think if there are connections, then that's not actually a con. And then like I said before, I'm not sure about topographic challenges.
So I'm thinking of something like Kalkari that's developing up on, I think it's Squawk Mountain, where it's into a hillside, and while there is a large amount of development there wouldn't necessarily be a reason to require them to split up their development and have through areas, because it just connects back into the back of a hillside. So that, from my perspective, is why it makes more sense in already walkable areas and areas that have the street connectivity or something behind the housing that you would want to get to.
That's right
Yes.
on the topographic? Okay. Okay, yeah. Then, I guess it doesn't prevent you if you have a grid of street connectivity somewhere else in the city, you still can build those smaller blocks.
Because you're right, it's a maximum if somebody comes in and they have another street behind them that they feel like it would be useful, they can always put it in. They also might find that it's useful if they had a plaza requirement to do something like that anyway. But in general, I think it should be a requirement in those areas as they redevelop, and then maybe other areas we really, really work with the developer and encourage it.
Okay. I think for this one, it would be helpful to just look into the idea you proposed about if there is this existing street grid in the area, if we could, because then it's basically like then it meets the same intent of selecting Central Issaquah Highlands and Talus. So I think that would be interesting to know if that is an option.
But how do you quantify it?
We're not the experts, we just ask the questions.
Well, and I guess I would have, I was not a part of the PPC discussions. My guess is that this was sorted through with them too.
This was.
And likely probably had a very similar discussion than this committee's having.
Well, they weren't trying to quantify how to look at whether or not an existing street grid is in place. It was primarily of these neighborhoods have been further developed more so than the other sub-areas of the city. And so it makes sense to maintain a lot of that walkability from breaking up the block lengths.
I guess the administration's recommendation is perhaps not to go more complicated at this point. And we'll be happy to bring back whatever you like, but.
Yeah, y'all are very creative people. I like hearing what you come up with. I think we have bits of code that already require connectivity to parks and trails. And I think, if I remember correctly from the code, that those require director, like the director's the person who says, oh, look, there's something that you need to connect to. There was also maybe a map. But I just wonder whether there's something that we can look at on that concept, whether it indicates a way to determine that.
Is this the last item before the committee decision?
Yes, it is.
Perhaps we bring this back to a next meeting. My sense, you've done extraordinary work in the last nearly 2.5 hours. Perhaps it would make sense, and we can take these comments back and perhaps have more to talk about. But let's bring this one item back at the next committee meeting or the one after that, just to finish the discussion.
And you could even bring the parking one back with some of those questions if that makes sense. But yeah.
I just think you've been focused it's been 2.5 hours. We'll do what you like, but my recommendation would be let's bring at least this one back. We'll have, I think Stephen can take this back to his colleagues, and certainly Minnie will be with us at the next meeting. That might be able to help resolve this.
If I may, I'm sorry, I would raise my hand if I had my video. The section of code where this block length shows up is a part that talks about plating in general, and it does, along with that block length requirement, it also says new streets should be connected and contiguous to encourage compact and walkable neighborhoods. Streets connect to existing street stubs on adjacent properties. So there is already some language in the proposed code that talks to this sort of connection, but we can
That was your
provide
main
more
concern.
details.
So, Council President, if you're satisfied with that, then perhaps that we go back to the PPC recommendation with that other language already there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. That probably meets our intent. So I'd be fine with that.
Great.
Okay. Okay. So last question on zero lot line. I watched the PPC. I was actually there for the PPC conversation, this one, where they made this addition about design characteristics. The one additional scenario in which it seems it might be useful for someone to use the zero lot line form of development is if there happened to be a smaller plot in one of the other areas. And the reason I ask about this is because I think the reasons against the zero lot line in the other neighbors, one of them is that you have this big building that's built all the way out to the edges of your lot. So if you had a size limit on the lot, that seems like that would be important to prevent that particular concern. But then the other thing, I'm trying to find it, but one of the cons for allowing citywide is also that you would have to potentially be on the neighbor's property to do exterior walls, et cetera. It seems if it's a small property and it's in one of these other neighborhoods that have these bigger lots, you would still have that space between the smaller lot and the neighboring house. So I wondered for those reasons, and again, we've looked at this before. PBC, I thought, had a good conversation, but since this is probably the last time we're going to look at this, and because I do think allowing smaller buildings, smaller residential buildings is important. We've seen that in our housing strategy, that the housing types are bigger than what people would prefer in terms of the housing stock versus people's preference. So I will just flag that if there has been, and I don't think that we talked about that, if there's some size limit we could put on plots that would have the zero lot line development if they were outside of these areas.
Just to clarify, so it's for zero lot line, the recommendation is to go to Central, Highland, South, but also other single-family zones that have a minimum 7.2. So you're asking, can we expand it beyond that?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if we could expand it beyond that if the lot is small itself. And if no city ever does this, then I would understand, but I did want to flag it. PBC had a good conversation, and one of the PBC commissioners talked about, the importance of this kind of development, and I agree. I think we should allow it, especially where it's appropriate. And this seems like one potential other use where it could be appropriate.
Well, now you've triggered two questions for me. ADUs, one of the ways you might be able to have an ADU in a backyard is, if you've got a smaller lot, is to be able to use a zero lot line. Is that considered? And then also, if you have a property that has a critical area, I think you're already allowed to kind of move toward the edge of your lot, but I was just thinking about that might be a useful way that you would want to use a zero lot line in order to keep the critical area from being built in.
I'm gonna have to ask Katie if she can remind me what was proposed on subdivisions.
Well, off the top of my head, I think that from your question, it sounded like it would be an option to use zero lot line if it was, making it more possible to avoid a critical area or or putting an ADU. But the ability to have a zero lot line would be based on the zone. So it would be, specific to, in this condition, we're saying single family zones that have a certain number of dwelling units per acre. So if it's part of the lot and dimensional standards, then yes, you could use it. You could put anything that was approved in that zero lot line. But I think, again, we're talking about new lots, not retrofitting old lots. I just would be concerned if folks were thinking that a zero lot line could be used in a situation where the whole community hadn't been established with that same rule, because it could result in buildings being too close together, for example. But in a community where it was established from the platting that zero lot lines were allowed, yes, it would be probably allowed if it was in the zoning code for ADUs to be on the lot line, or for homes to be on the lot line in order to avoid critical areas.
Yeah, no, you just reminded me this is about plating, so that totally makes sense. And I'm feeling pretty good about that.
Okay, but, I mean, the ADU was another one, so you can't then build an ADU in one of these other neighborhoods using the zero lot line form. I mean, that's the implication, I believe.
That's what I was saying, yes.
Okay. But is this zero lot line code portion just related to platting new subdivisions, or is it related to the ability to build just an individual home?
This is specific to the subdivision section.
Yeah. So if we were looking at whether you can build an ADU on your current property, that wouldn't be related to this conversation. That would be related to what are the setback requirements for ADUs.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. So that's something I'm gonna have to look up elsewhere. Yeah, because this is just about, like, if you have a property or a set of properties, you're trying to figure out what are the through lanes and can they build to the edge when you're kind of establishing what that neighborhood is.
But if you have a small lot somewhere else in the city, doesn't the zero lot line provisions apply to that or if you have a small lot in a neighborhood that isn't one of these neighborhoods, you wouldn't be able to build a zero lot line form house on it. If it was a vacant lot, I realize not a lot of them, but I think that's the case.
I think that's what we're saying. The exception would be if, I think the more appropriate step, if you wanted to allow zero lot line development in an existing neighborhood, it would be a rezone process, which would reestablish the form and intensity standards for that established neighborhood. Otherwise, I think we would be creating a lot of non-conforming use situations, or at least the potential for conflicts. So if a property is subdividing and it's surrounded by other established development, and it wants to be a zero lot line, we would need to look closely at the adjacent properties to make sure that this new this new established zero lot line community wouldn't create conflicts, mostly for building separation.
Okay. I think I'm fine proceeding. I think we can look up the ADU ramifications, or if staff is able to provide that, that would also be helpful. But I think we've come to a understanding of this, so we can proceed.
So keep the PPC recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's what we've decided. And this loops back to one of my original comments, which is I think that almost all uses for where you would want to build, where anyone would want to build this zero lot line form of building, which is just a building that goes out to the lot line, it would be in these neighborhoods. So there's just these other sort of edge cases that I wanted to ask about. I think we've covered it.
Yes, that's everything. Thank you.
Okay, so this one is part of our continuing Title 18 conversation, so I don't believe that we have make a recommendation. I'll report back to council on what we discussed, but don't believe we have a recommendation. And the only one that I noted that I had a difference of opinion, although I would be fine, especially given that it's the administration's recommendation, is on that transparency. I would be fine with not regulating that, but the recommendation and your preference was to go with the staff recommendations. So I will also be fine with that. So I think then we have no further business. Does the administration have what you need from this conversation? Yes. Okay. I believe we have announcements. Any announcements? No. Okay. Then we are adjourned at 9 p.m. Thank you, everyone.